The dusty auction yard lay under the weight of a sweltering afternoon sun, its air thick with the mingled scents of hay, sweat, and uncertainty. Wooden pens creaked as restless animals shifted within, their shadows stretching long across the trampled dirt. Men in worn hats leaned against rails, murmuring in low voices, eyes fixed on the creatures whose worth would soon be shouted over the crackle of the auctioneer's microphone. Among them stood a pen unlike the rest, its occupant pacing in jagged circles, ears pinned flat, eyes sharp as glass. It was a donkey, but not one that fit the familiar, placid image. His coat was the color of storm clouds, marred with scars old and new. Each movement was charged, as if the earth itself might give way beneath him. The auctioneer had already warned the crowd. Untamable, he called it. Mean as they come. Dangerous. Best for, well, nothing, if I'm honest. The laughter from a few nearby bidders was sharp and unkind, a release of tension rather than humor. The donkey threw back his head at the sound, letting out a bray that rattled the boards of his pen. No one stepped forward for a closer look. Most kept a safe distance, some out of caution, others out of disinterest. Near the back of the crowd, an old woman stood quietly, her frame stooped but steady. She wore a faded blue dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat that had seen as many summers as the wrinkles lining her face. Her eyes, however, were unclouded and alert, fixed on the restless animal as if she were reading a story only she could see. No one paid her much attention. She was a fixture of these small-town auctions, always browsing, rarely bidding. The sale wore on, animals moving through the pens in a steady rhythm. Calves were bought for breeding, mules for work, ponies for children. Then, with an almost reluctant shift, the auctioneer signaled for the donkey to be brought out. Two men wrestled the lead rope, their boots digging into the dirt as the animal resisted every step. His hooves struck the ground with defiance, his eyes scanning the crowd as though daring someone to approach. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced. A fine, well, an unusual animal. Strong, stubborn, will fight you every step of the way. Who'll start me at 50? His voice rose into the dry air, but the crowd remained still. A few smirks, a cough. Someone muttered, not worth the trouble. The old woman's gaze never wavered. She noticed the way the donkey's muscles tensed before each pull, the subtle hitch in his left step, the way his ears flicked toward every sound. He wasn't wild, she thought. He was afraid and tired. The kind of tired that made you dangerous, because trust was a currency you no longer traded in. 40, the auctioneer tried. Silence. 20. He chuckled to mask his frustration. Surely someone wants to give this fella a chance. The donkey reared suddenly, forcing one of the handlers to stumble back. The crowd reacted with a mix of laughter and uneasy murmurs. And then a voice broke through. 10. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a note struck on an old piano. Heads turned, searching for the speaker. The old woman stepped forward, the sun catching the silver in her hair. Her expression was calm, her hands still at her sides. 10, the auctioneer repeated, as if certain he'd misheard. Well, 10 it is. Do I hear 15? No one answered. The handlers exchanged doubtful looks. The donkey stood motionless now, eyes fixed on the woman, as if recognizing something the others could not. Sold, the auctioneer declared, almost relieved to move on. The gavel fell with a dull thud. The crowd began to disperse, attention shifting to the next lot, but a small circle of curious onlookers lingered. Some whispered that she'd lost her mind. Others speculated she might be using the donkey for guard work, or worse, just keeping him for show. But the old woman didn't seem to hear them. She walked toward the pen, slow and deliberate, her steps steady in the dust. The handlers met her at the gate, one of them holding out the frayed lead rope like a warning. He's trouble, the taller one said. Won't let you get close without. He stopped, because she had already stepped inside. The donkey's ears twitched. His weight shifted, his front hooves stamping lightly. But he didn't rear, didn't lunge. The woman paused a few feet away, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't reach for him. She simply stood there, the way one might stand beside a river they intend to cross only when the water allows it. The moment stretched, the sounds of the auction fading into a muffled backdrop. After what felt like a long minute, the donkey lowered his head slightly, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. The woman's lips curved, barely a smile, more a quiet understanding, and she reached out slowly, until her fingers brushed the rough edge of his mane. He flinched, then stilled. The handlers exchanged astonished looks. Without a word, she took the rope, not pulling, just holding it loosely, and the donkey followed her out of the pen. It wasn't smooth. His gait was hesitant, his head jerking once or twice, but he followed. The murmurs in the crowd swelled. As they walked toward the edge of the yard, the sun dipping lower, the donkey glanced back once, ears pricked toward the fading sound of the auctioneer's voice. Then he turned forward again, keeping pace with the woman. No one knew where she was taking him. No one asked. But in the quiet way they moved together, there was a hint, just the faintest, that this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of something no one there had imagined. The road out of town was a narrow ribbon of dirt, winding between fields browned by late summer heat. The old woman walked steadily, the donkey trailing behind her. His hooves struck the ground with a hesitant rhythm, each step a small negotiation between resistance and trust. Dust clung to the hem of her faded blue dress, but she paid it no mind. She had walked this road countless times, though never with a companion quite like him. Her name was Martha Calloway, a widow who had lived on the edge of town for as long as anyone could remember. She kept a modest plot of land, half a dozen chickens, a vegetable patch, and an apple tree whose gnarled limbs bent low in autumn. She had no family nearby, and most folks assumed she preferred it that way. But those who knew her well enough understood that Martha didn't dislike people. She simply kept her circle small, offering her kindness sparingly but wholeheartedly. The donkey tugged at the rope once, testing her grip. Martha stopped, turned, and met his eyes. "I'm not here to fight you," she said, her voice even, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime around stubborn creatures. She waited until his ears twitched forward again, before continuing down the road. By the time they reached her property, the sun had sunk low enough to paint the sky in streaks of gold and rose. The small farmhouse sat a short distance from a weathered barn, its paint long gone, replaced by the silver sheen of aged wood. She led the donkey to the corral beside the barn, opening the gate and stepping back so he could enter on his own terms. He stood just beyond the threshold for a long moment, nostrils flaring, before walking inside. The central conflict of the day, the question of what to do with a creature labeled Untamable, was now Martha's to face. She leaned on the fence rail, watching him explore the pen. He sniffed the water trough, pawed at the packed dirt, then lifted his head toward the barn as if assessing its secrets. Martha knew enough about animals to recognize that whatever had earned him his reputation wasn't simple bad behavior. She had seen fear wear many disguises, and stubbornness was one of its most convincing. Night came quickly. Inside the farmhouse, Martha lit a lamp and sat at the small kitchen table, the window behind her framing the shadowy shape of the donkey in the corral. She thought of the way he'd stood still when she'd first touched him, the flicker of decision in his eyes. Trust was a slow-growing thing, especially when it had been broken, but she'd learned that it could sprout in the most unlikely places. The next morning began with the sharp cry of a rooster. Martha stepped outside with a bucket of water and a scoop of feed. The donkey was already awake, standing near the fence, ears forward. He didn't approach when she entered the corral, but neither did he retreat. She set the feed down and stepped back, allowing him to come to it on his own. His movements were measured, almost suspicious, as though he expected the food to vanish at any moment. Days passed in this slow rhythm. Martha spoke to him as she worked, short, steady words that carried no demand. She noticed small changes, the way he no longer pinned his ears when she entered, how he began to linger closer when she brought water. Still, he remained guarded, his muscles coiled as if ready to flee or fight. It was on the fourth day that Martha saw the first real shift. She was mending a section of the corral fence when the donkey approached without prompting. He stood a few feet away, head tilted slightly, watching her hands move. When she paused and extended her palm, he stepped closer and breathed against her skin. The contact was brief, but it was enough to stir something in her chest, a spark of hope. That evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind rattled the barn doors, and rain began to fall in hard, slanting sheets. Martha stepped onto the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and saw the donkey pacing the corral, his body tense. She hurried to the barn and opened the gate, calling softly to him. For a moment, he stayed where he was, rain running down his back, before finally trotting toward her. She led him inside, the air smelling of damp hay and wood. They waited out the storm together, Martha sitting on an overturned crate, the donkey standing close enough that she could hear the steady sound of his breathing. The thunder rolled, but he didn't shy or pull away. She felt the weight of the moment, the quiet understanding that this was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. In the days that followed, their bond began to deepen. Martha started leading him beyond the corral, walking the edges of her property. At first, he balked at the open space, eyes darting toward every rustle in the grass. But Martha kept her pace slow, her voice calm, and he began to match her steps. One afternoon, while tending to her vegetable garden, she noticed movement near the fence line. A neighbor, Harold Thompson, was leaning on the post, watching with a curious frown. "That the beast you bought at auction?" he asked. "That's him," Martha replied without looking up. "Could have sworn he'd have killed someone by now," Harold said, half joking. "Not every fight's about teeth and hooves," Martha answered, straightening. "Sometimes it's about learning who you can stand next to without running." Harold didn't have much to say after that, and he wandered off down the road. But his words lingered with her. The town had already written the donkey off as dangerous, and Martha knew that if he ever lashed out again, even in fear, they would be quick to demand his removal, or worse. The challenge wasn't just in earning his trust. It was in proving to the rest of the world that he was worth it. As summer's end crept closer, Martha began planning the next step. The donkey needed more than safety. He needed purpose. Without it, his energy would turn inward, twisting into the same restless defiance that had marked him before. She thought of the small wagon stored in her barn and used for years. Perhaps, with patience, he could be taught to pull it. It would give him a task, something to direct his strength toward. That evening, she stood beside him in the corral, the sky burning orange as the sun sank behind the hills. She placed her hand on his neck, feeling the warmth beneath his coat. "We've got work ahead," she murmured. The donkey flicked his ears, the gesture neither agreement nor refusal, but she took it as a step forward. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of the fields and the faint promise of autumn. Martha looked out over her land, knowing the path ahead would be slow, maybe even dangerous. But the quiet weight of the donkey's presence beside her told her one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Morning sunlight spilled across the corral, casting long shadows over the packed dirt. The donkey stood near the fence, ears swiveling toward the farmhouse door as Martha stepped out. In her hands, she carried a bundle of rope and a worn leather harness. It had been years since she'd last used it, the straps softened by age, but still strong. She knew today would test them both. The days of simple coexistence had built a foundation of trust, but trust alone wouldn't keep the donkey from being judged as a lost cause. The town still whispered about him, and Martha felt the weight of those voices pressing in. If she could teach him to work, to prove his worth in plain sight, it might silence them. And if it didn't, at least she would know she had tried. She approached the corral slowly, her voice a low hum of reassurance. The donkey watched her warily, eyes flicking from the harness to her face. She laid the leather on the ground a few feet away and crouched beside it, letting him decide whether to investigate. He took a cautious step forward, sniffing the straps before pulling back, ears twitching. "It's not a trap," she murmured, straightening to her feet. With deliberate slowness, she lifted the harness and draped it over her arm. The first attempt to place it over his head ended with him jerking back, rope taut between them. Martha didn't fight him. She let the tension ease, then stepped away, giving him room. This dance continued for nearly an hour, advance, retreat, try again, until finally, the harness slipped into place. The moment it settled on his back, he stiffened, muscles quivering. Martha kept her hand on his neck, speaking in the same calm tone she had used since the day they met. Gradually, his breathing slowed, and she fastened the straps. Their first session was short. Martha didn't ask him to pull anything, only to walk beside her with the harness on. They circled the corral, his steps uneven at first, then steadier. When she finally removed the harness, he gave a sharp shake of his head, as though shaking off old fears. She smiled faintly. Small victories were still victories. The following days built on that progress. Martha introduced a light wooden sled, little more than a plank with 2 runners. At first, the sound of it dragging behind startled him, and he spun in a tight circle, rope snapping between them. She let him stand until his fear ebbed, then tried again, her patience as unyielding as the hills surrounding her land. By the end of the week, he was pulling the sled without balking, his stride evening out with each circuit. Martha watched him closely, noting how his ears stayed forward more often now, how his eyes no longer darted at every unfamiliar sound. He was changing, not in the way people meant when they said breaking an animal, but in the way a locked door changes when someone finally finds the right key. One afternoon, Harold Thompson returned, leaning on the fence just as he had weeks before. "Well, I'll be," he said, watching the donkey drag the sled across the corral. "Didn't think you'd get that far." "Neither did he, I reckon," Martha replied, keeping her gaze on the donkey. Harold chuckled. "You gonna take him into town? Let folks see." "Not yet," she said. "I'm not showing him off until he's ready, and I'm not rushing him to make anyone feel better about what they said at that auction." Harold nodded, a faint trace of respect softening his tone. "Fair enough." The next stage was the wagon. It took nearly half a day to ready it, cleaning out years of dust, checking the wheels, oiling the axles. When she finally led the donkey to it, his nostrils flared, but he didn't pull away. Martha worked in silence, attaching the traces and adjusting the straps until everything sat just right. The first pull was hesitant. The weight was more than the sled, and the sound of the wooden wheels crunching over dirt seemed to puzzle him. Martha walked beside him, one hand on the rope, the other lightly brushing his shoulder. Slowly, step by step, they made their way down the path that led around the property. Halfway through the circuit, a pheasant burst from the grass, wings beating furiously. The donkey startled, lunging forward, the wagon rattling behind. Martha held firm, her voice steady despite the jolt in her chest. He slowed, then stopped entirely, sides heaving. She stroked his neck until the tremor in his muscles eased. Then they continued on. By the time they returned to the barn, the tension had faded from his body. Martha unhitched the wagon and let him roam the corral while she leaned on the fence, watching him with quiet pride. The sight of him standing there, calm, capable, was proof of how far they had come. But the work was far from over. The real test would come when they left the safety of the farm. If he could keep his composure in town, surrounded by noise, strangers, and the same people who had ridden him off, then perhaps the tide of opinion could be turned. That decision weighed on her as the days shortened and the air began to cool. She started walking him along the dirt road leading toward town, first without the wagon, then with it. Each trip took them farther, the donkey's confidence growing with every mile. On one of these walks, they met a young boy sitting by the roadside, his knees pulled to his chest. He looked up as they approached, eyes wide. "Is that the wild donkey from the auction?" he asked. "That's him," Martha said. "He doesn't look wild," the boy murmured, reaching a tentative hand toward the animal. The donkey sniffed his fingers, then stood still as the boy stroked his muzzle. Martha felt a quiet swell of satisfaction. Small encounters like this could change stories faster than any declaration. When they reached home that evening, the sky was streaked with the deep reds of approaching autumn. Martha unhitched the wagon and let the donkey into the corral, watching as he stood facing the horizon, ears pricked toward the fading light. She knew they were nearing the moment that would define him in the eyes of the town. The thought brought both resolve and a sliver of worry. The bond they had built was strong, but trust was always fragile. One loud noise, one wrong move, and the whispers could return, sharper than before. As she closed the barn doors for the night, Martha glanced back at him. He was watching her, still and quiet, the space between them filled with unspoken understanding. She placed her hand on the doorframe and whispered into the dim air, "We're almost there." The donkey flicked his ears in the direction of her voice, and for the first time, she felt the faintest certainty that he was ready. The morning they set out for town, the air was crisp with the bite of early autumn. A thin mist clung to the edges of the fields, softening the hard lines of fence posts and hedgerows. Martha stood beside the wagon, adjusting the harness one last time. The donkey stood still, his breath puffing in small clouds, ears swiveling at the distant sounds of waking farms. His composure gave her a cautious kind of hope, though she knew the day ahead would test them both. The road to town was quiet at first. The crunch of wagon wheels over gravel filled the silence, punctuated by the rhythmic fall of hooves. Martha walked alongside him for the first mile, letting him feel her steady presence. Only when they reached the main road did she climb onto the wagon seat. From there, she could see the steeple of the church rising above the rooftops, a reminder of just how close they were to curious eyes. As they entered the outskirts, the calm began to fracture. Dogs barked from behind fences, their sharp voices carrying through the air. A cart rattled past, pulled by a pair of mules, and the driver gave a long, appraising look. "That the wild one?" he called out. "That's him," Martha replied, keeping her voice even. "Well, I'll be." The man's tone was more surprise than mockery, but it still drew the attention of others. Heads turned. Murmurs followed them like shadows. The market square was already busy, stalls lined with produce, cloth, and tools. The scent of baked bread drifted through the air, mingling with the tang of fresh-cut lumber from the carpenter's stall. Martha guided the donkey toward the open space near the fountain, her hands light on the reins. He hesitated at the swell of noise, his weight shifting, but did not bolt. She dismounted and began unloading the small crates from the wagon, apples from her tree, jars of preserves, a bundle of herbs tied with twine. The donkey stood beside her, ears flicking at each sudden sound, but his hooves stayed planted. People watched from a cautious distance at first, but curiosity soon overcame hesitation. A young girl approached, her hand clutched in her mother's. "Is he safe?" she asked. "As long as you're gentle," Martha said. The girl reached out, her fingers brushing the donkey's muzzle. He lowered his head slightly, accepting the touch without flinching. The mother smiled faintly, murmuring something about how different he seemed from what she'd heard. By midday, the square was alive with talk of the transformation. A few of the same men who had scoffed at the auction now lingered near the wagon, their skepticism tempered by what they saw. Harold Thompson wandered up, leaning on the edge of a stall. "Well, I reckon you've proven your point," he said with a nod toward the donkey. "Wasn't about proving a point," Martha replied. "It was about giving him a fair chance." But just as the tide of opinion seemed to be shifting, a sharp crack shattered the moment, the sound of a barrel tipping over near the cooper's shop. The noise rang out like a gunshot. The donkey's body tensed, eyes wide, muscles coiling as if ready to flee. Martha stepped quickly to his side, her hand finding the thick curve of his neck. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice steady despite the hammering of her own heart. For a moment, it could have gone either way, flight or trust. Then, with a long breath, he stilled, his weight settling back onto all four hooves. The onlookers who had tensed now relaxed, murmuring in quiet amazement. "Untamable," they said. Someone remarked. The rest of the day passed without incident. Martha sold her goods, spoke with neighbors, and let the donkey rest in the shade of the wagon. Each time someone approached, she allowed them to greet him, building a picture in their minds that would overwrite the old stories. When the market began to wind down, Martha packed the empty crates and climbed onto the wagon seat. The donkey stepped forward at her signal, the wheels creaking into motion. As they left the square, she glanced back to see several people watching them go, not with fear, but with something closer to respect. The road home felt lighter, as though the day had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Still, Martha knew this was only one step in a longer journey. Trust, once built, had to be guarded. One lapse, and the old whispers could return. Halfway back, they passed a narrow lane bordered by wildflowers. Martha slowed the wagon, letting the donkey graze on the tall grass at the edge. The sun was dipping toward the horizon now, its light warm and golden. She reached down to stroke his neck, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "You did well today," she murmured. The donkey flicked his ears toward her voice, chewing slowly, unbothered by the world beyond the lane. When they reached the farmhouse, the light was fading to dusk. Martha unhitched the wagon and led him into the corral. He followed without resistance, the rope loose in her hand. She removed the harness, hanging it over the fence, and watched as he moved to the far side of the pen, where the moonlight was just beginning to silver the ground. From the porch, she could see him standing there, quiet and still, as if he, too, was reflecting on the day. She felt a swell of pride, not just for him, but for the stubborn hope that had carried them both from the auction yard to this moment. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of apples from the orchard. Martha pulled her shawl tighter and sat down, the boards of the porch warm beneath her. She thought of all the voices that had once called him hopeless, and all the moments that could have proven them right. But instead, there was this, a bond forged in patience, tested in the open, and strong enough to endure the noise of the world. In the stillness, she whispered into the dark, "We're not finished yet." The donkey, standing in the shadowed corner of the corral, lifted his head at the sound, ears pricked toward her, and though no one else was there to see it, Martha knew they had crossed an invisible line that day, one that could not be undone. The days following their trip to town carried a quiet, steady rhythm. Martha worked her small farm, and the donkey, now answering to the name Ash, for the stormy gray of his coat, moved with an ease that had not been there before. He grazed in the mornings, dozed in the shade at noon, and walked the fence line as though keeping silent watch over the land. But trust, Martha knew, was not something to be earned once and stored away. It was a living thing, needing care and consistency. And so, each day, she let Ash out with the wagon, sometimes to the orchard, sometimes down the long road past the creek. Their pace was never rushed. It was the journey that mattered. One afternoon, a knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, Harold stood there, hat in hand. "Town council's holding the harvest fair next week," he said. "They'd like you to bring him. Folks want to see for themselves." Martha hesitated. A fair was noisier than a market, crowded with music, games, shouting children. "That's a lot to ask of him," she said slowly. "Maybe," Harold agreed, "but I think they need to see what you've done." She spent the week preparing, not with tricks or displays, but with patience. They walked through open spaces, paused near clattering tools, let children approach from unexpected angles. She watched Ash absorb each moment, his reaction softening, his breathing steadying. When the day of the fair came, the air was bright with the scent of roasted corn and cinnamon. Colorful banners swayed overhead, and the sound of fiddles mingled with the laughter of children. Martha guided Ash through the entrance, her hand resting lightly on his lead rope. Heads turned, and conversations paused mid-sentence. At first, people kept their distance, remembering the stories of the wild donkey from the auction. But as the afternoon wore on, curiosity drew them closer. Children reached out, and Ash lowered his head to let them touch his muzzle. Farmers examined the wagon he pulled, nodding in quiet approval. Then came the moment that would live in their memories. One of the fiddlers set down his bow, walked over, and placed a garland of late-blooming flowers around Ash's neck. The donkey stood still, ears forward, his dark eyes calm. A ripple of applause spread through the crowd, not loud or raucous, but warm and genuine. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the fairground in gold, Martha led Ash toward the gate. Harold caught her eye and gave a slow nod of respect. No words were needed. On the walk home, the fields glowing in the fading light, Martha felt the quiet satisfaction of a story completed. Not just for her, but for Ash. The world had given up on him once. Now it had seen the truth. At the farmhouse, she opened the corral gate, and Ash stepped inside without hesitation. For a moment, he turned back, his gaze meeting hers in the twilight. And in that silent exchange, Martha knew they had crossed from mere survival into something far rarer, trust that would last the rest of their days.